Galatian Christians looked at circumcision as a ritualistic act, which, although painful, was a small price to pay for salvation. Paul knew that once they accepted these Jewish rituals as a part of Christian faith, they would be co-opted and bound to follow the Mosaic Law. At that point, the focus would no longer be on Christ and his sacrifice, but they would look to the rituals and traditions to save them. Paul, in his passage, points out the consequences of accepting circumcision, the high price of being misfocused on the wrong thing. In verse 1, Paul gives a concise summary of his message. He says to them, Christ freed us in order that we might be free of the law. The law leads to bondage and grace leads to freedom. It is foolish to return to the ritualistic bondage that is contained in the law. Paul is seeing his teachings about to go down the drain as Galatian Christians were considering not just ritualistic circumcision, but they were considering accepting the law and Jewish teaching for their salvation. This decision was not just a harmless precaution. This act showed a belief that Jesus' death and resurrection was in vain, that salvation came through ritual and tradition. Paul was not going to see this change come, and so he urged them to stand firm, believing in the grace that comes through Jesus Christ. Then Paul's attention turned from the argument against circumcision and the rituals to the advocates of circumcision. Paul laments that while the Galatian church once ran well, they no longer were doing well, and that was not from God. It was from these advocates that were leading them astray, these Judaizers. Speaking to the Galatians and speaking to us, Paul tells us how a little corruption can spoil the whole church, the whole organization. Think about it. Our leaders set the spirit and the tone, the priority of our organizations, and it only takes a small wrong influence to corrupt an entire church and divide it and cause it to argue and destroy. In the midst of this trouble, Paul shows us how we should act when we are in this trouble. He expresses his confidence that the final decision that these Galatian Christians will make will be one from God, because God's purpose is going to be fulfilled. Paul, since accepting Jesus, had been the target of Jewish persecution. They had tried to capture him time after time, and here he tries to reason with the Galatians about his teaching. He says, if as a Christian I were preaching the law and circumcision, why would the Jews still be trying to persecute me? Obviously, I'm not teaching about circumcision and the law. I am preaching about the Christ and about the cross and using grace as our salvation. And that is why the Jews are after me. Still reasoning, Paul says, if you cut a little flesh and you think that brings pleasure to God, then why don't you just castrate yourself and give God even more pleasure? His sarcasm seems a little cold, but Paul is trying to make a point that these rituals, these things that we might do, don't save us. What is important is being focused on God as and Jesus as our salvation. Paul tells the Galatians that they were free from the law, but this does not justify them freely sinning. We are to love our neighbors as ourselves. Paul explains that there is a fight between the flesh and the spirit, and we must stand firm and always stay away from the temptations of the flesh and seek God. Paul is telling us that rituals and traditions must focus us on God if they are to have any value. They must bring us closer to God and must help us grow as people so that we can love our neighbors just as we love ourselves. The average attention span of a citizen of the United States is between 8 and 12 seconds. So it is so easy for us to be distracted when we rush through our grace in a hurry to eat, not focusing on the words that we say to God that prayer is just a ritual that does not bring us closer to God or to our neighbor. The same occurs when we take communion thinking about our bills or our problems or our work or something else that is about to happen. The sacrament becomes a snack, and it has no worth because it doesn't bring us closer to God. Paul wants our religious traditions to focus us on Jesus, to help us grow our relationship with God, and to make us better Christians so that we can love one another. Christ died so that we could be free of the law and free of rituals, but he did not die for us to run and seek unbridled satisfaction of our flesh. We are called to love one another. We are called to make a difference in this world and to help our brothers and sisters. That's the lesson for this week. You guys have a great week. Bye.
I'm free. Praise the Lord.